For 3 years, Diane Hastings visited a grave every single Sunday, laid fresh flowers on the same patch of grass, and told her children their father was gone. She believed it completely because there was a casket, a funeral, a death certificate with a raised state seal, and a life insurance check that had already been cashed. What she did not know, what none of them knew, was that the man they had buried was not inside that casket at all. He was 3 states away, living under a different name, watching his own funeral unfold from a safe distance, because the truth was simpler and darker than any of them could have imagined. Walter Hastings did not die. He disappeared on purpose, and it would take his family 3 years to find out exactly how far he was willing to go to escape the mess he had made of his own life. This is not a story about a man who died too soon. It is a story about a man who was drowning long before he ever stepped near the water that was supposed to have killed him, drowning in debt he had hidden from everyone who loved him, until the weight of it became, in his mind, heavier than the thought of losing his own family completely. What makes this story different from most is not the fraud itself, though the fraud was elaborate enough on its own. It is what happened 3 years later, when a routine encounter in a hardware store parking lot in a completely different state unraveled everything Walter Hastings had built to stay hidden. Stay with me, because by the time this story reaches its end, you may find yourself wondering how well any of us really know the people sitting across the table from us every night. Here is what you need to understand before we go further. Walter Hastings was a well-liked contractor in a small town in western Pennsylvania. A husband, a father of 2, a man everyone in his community believed they knew well. Behind that reputation, he was hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. Debt his wife knew almost nothing about. Debt that had grown quietly for years until it became, in his mind, impossible to escape through any honest means. The questions that drive this story are simple. How does a man convince an entire town, including his own family, that he has died? What does it take to disappear that completely and stay hidden for 3 full years? And what finally brought him back into the light in a moment neither he nor his family ever saw coming? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Walter Hastings grew up in a small town called Brennerville, a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least believed they did. His father, Earl Hastings, had built a modest home renovation business over 3 decades, starting with little more than a pickup truck and a reputation for honest work, the kind of reputation that in a town like Brennerville mattered more than any advertising ever could. Walter grew up working alongside his father on weekends and summers, learning the trade the way most contractors in that part of the country did, hands-on, one job at a time, absorbing not just the skills, but the unspoken code that a man's word and his work were supposed to mean something. He took over the business in his late 20s after Earl's health began declining, inheriting both the tools of the trade and the weight of a reputation he felt responsible for maintaining. Those who knew Walter during this period describe a serious, careful young man, someone who took his father's legacy seriously enough that he sometimes underbid jobs just to make sure a longtime client was taken care of, a habit his wife would later say she both admired and occasionally worried about, since it meant the business's margins were often thinner than they should have been. He married Diane, a school teacher he had known since high school, in a small ceremony at the same church where both of their parents had been married a generation earlier. Those who attended the wedding still talk about how at ease the two of them seemed together, how Diane's easy warmth balanced Walter's more reserved, methodical nature, the two of them fitting together the way people in Brennerville like to say a good marriage should. Together they built what looked, from every angle their neighbors could see, like a genuinely happy life. They had 2 children, a son named Cody and a daughter named Maddie, and a house on the edge of town with a wraparound porch. Walter had built himself the summer before Cody was born, using leftover lumber from a job that had run under budget. For the first decade of their marriage, the business did reasonably well. Steady work in a community that trusted Walter's name and his father's reputation before him. Diane has said that period of their lives felt, in hindsight, almost impossibly simple, filled with ordinary milestones. Cody's first steps on that same porch, Maddie's kindergarten graduation, Sunday dinners with Walter's aging father before he passed away, family vacations to the coast that they saved for carefully all year. Nothing about those years suggested the family was anything other than exactly what it appeared to be from the outside. A hard-working, close-knit household with its share of ordinary struggles, but nothing resembling the kind of hidden crisis that would eventually consume them. Trouble began quietly, the way it often does, when Walter took on a larger commercial renovation project that promised significant profit, but required him to front a substantial amount of money for materials and subcontractors before the client's payments came through. The client's business failed midway through the project, leaving Walter holding tens of thousands of dollars in unpaid invoices and material costs he had already covered personally, believing the remaining payments were simply a matter of time. Rather than telling Diane the full extent of what had happened, Walter took out a loan against their home to cover the immediate shortfall, certain he could recover the loss with new projects before anyone needed to know. That recovery never fully materialized. Instead, one loan became two, then three. Each one meant to cover the gap left by the one before it, a pattern that continued quietly for nearly 5 years. Walter maintained the appearance of a thriving business the entire time, taking on new projects, hiring subcontractors, keeping the wraparound porch freshly painted and the family vacations coming, all while the debt underneath grew into something he could no longer see a way out of. He has since described those 5 years as feeling like running on a treadmill that kept quietly increasing its speed, each new loan requiring larger monthly payments that in turn required him to take on more work than the business could realistically sustain. Work he often underbid out of the same instinct his father had taught him, an instinct that had once been a strength and had slowly become one of the very things dragging him under. He began taking side jobs under the table, cash work he never reported, hoping to build a private cushion that Diane would never need to know about, money that inevitably went toward interest payments rather than ever accumulating into anything resembling real relief. By his own later account, Walter reached a point roughly 3 years before his disappearance where he understood, with a clarity that frightened him, that there was no version of continuing the business as it existed that would ever fully resolve the debt, only versions that might delay the collapse a little longer. He has said he considered, more than once, simply telling Diane everything, sitting her down and explaining the full scope of what he had hidden from her for years, and that he came close to doing exactly that on at least 2 separate occasions, once after a particularly difficult conversation with a creditor, and once late at night after Diane had fallen asleep beside him, when he lay awake rehearsing the words in his head until sunrise, without ever finding the courage to say them out loud. What stopped him, he has since explained, was not primarily fear of Diane's anger, though that fear existed too, but something closer to shame, a conviction that admitting the truth would mean admitting he had failed to live up to the version of himself his father had raised him to be. A man whose word and work were supposed to mean something in a town like Brennerville. That shame, left unspoken for years, hardened slowly into something else entirely. A belief that disappearing might somehow be a kinder outcome for his family than watching him admit in real time exactly how badly he had let them down. By the time Cody turned 14 and Maddie turned 11, the family's financial foundation was, unbeknownst to either of them, close to collapse. Walter had taken out a life insurance policy worth $450,000 several years earlier, back when the business was still healthy, intended as ordinary, responsible planning for his family's future. As his debts mounted with no realistic path to repayment, that policy began to occupy his thoughts in a way it never had before, not as protection for his family after his death, but as a possible way out of a situation he had convinced himself he could not survive any other way, at least not with his dignity, his marriage, or his reputation in Brennerville still intact. Friends and family who knew Walter during this period described someone who seemed increasingly withdrawn, more tired than usual, prone to sudden irritability that felt out of character for a man they had always known as easygoing. Diane noticed the change too, though she attributed it to the ordinary stress of running a small business, never suspecting the scale of what her husband was actually carrying. Looking back, she has said there were nights Walter would sit alone on the porch, long after the rest of the family had gone to bed, staring out at nothing in particular, and she assumed, at the time, that he simply needed space to decompress after a long day. The plan that Walter eventually settled on took shape over several months, developed alone, without a single other person aware of what he was preparing to do. He began taking solo fishing trips to a large reservoir, roughly 40 minutes from Brennerville, Trips he framed to Diane as a way to clear his head from the stress of the business, trips that became more frequent as the months passed. During these trips, Walter quietly studied the currents, the boat launch patterns, and the general lack of surveillance along one particular stretch of the reservoir's shoreline, a place he had fished as a boy and knew better than almost anyone else in the county. On a Saturday morning in early October, Walter told Diane he was heading out for one of his usual solo fishing trips, kissed her goodbye in the kitchen, and drove his truck to the reservoir as he had dozens of times before. He has since described that final drive in unusually specific detail. The fog still sitting low over the fields along the county road, a particular song playing on the truck radio that he says he has not been able to listen to since, the strange, almost dissociated calm that settled over him as he replayed the plan one final time in his mind. A plan he had rehearsed so many times mentally that the actual execution of it felt, in the moment, almost like watching himself from a slight distance rather than fully living through it. What Diane did not know was that Walter had spent the preceding weeks quietly withdrawing cash in small increments, purchasing a used vehicle under circumstances designed to avoid easy tracing, and arranging a place to stay several states away under a name that was not his own, obtained through channels he later admitted. During eventual questioning, he was deeply ashamed to have pursued. He had also spent several of his earlier solo trips memorizing not just the currents and boat launch patterns, but the precise timing of when the launch area typically emptied out on weekday mornings versus weekends, choosing a Saturday specifically because he knew from months of observation that the earliest fishermen tended to arrive later on weekends, giving him a wider window to disappear into the tree line unobserved. Walter left his truck, parked at the boat launch with his fishing gear scattered nearby, left a life jacket floating deliberately near the shoreline downstream, and disappeared into the wooded area surrounding the reservoir on foot, walking nearly 6 miles to a prearranged pickup point where the vehicle he had purchased weeks earlier was waiting. He has described that 6-mile walk as the longest of his life, not physically, since he had walked far greater distances hunting with his father as a boy, but psychologically, every step carrying him further from a life he still, even in that moment, was not entirely certain he could actually go through with. He has said he stopped twice along the trail, once to vomit into the underbrush from the sheer weight of what he was doing, and once simply to sit on a fallen log for nearly 20 minutes, staring back in the direction of the reservoir, before eventually forcing himself to stand and keep walking. By the time anyone realized he had not returned home that evening, Walter Hastings was already hours away, driving toward a life he had spent months quietly preparing, leaving behind a family who had no reason yet to suspect anything beyond a terrible accident. The search that followed consumed Brennerville for nearly 2 weeks. Local search and rescue teams combed the reservoir, and surrounding woods, volunteers from the community showed up by the dozens to help, and Diane spent those 2 weeks in a state she has since described as barely functioning, caught between desperate hope and a growing, sickening certainty that something terrible had happened. Divers searched significant sections of the reservoir without recovering a body, a detail that investigators at the time attributed to the reservoir's depth, its underwater currents, and the difficulty of recovery in a body of water that size, rather than to anything more deliberate. Neighbors brought casseroles to the Hastings house every evening during those 2 weeks, a small-town ritual of grief that Diane has said felt both comforting and unbearable at the same time, a constant stream of people reminding her, simply by showing up, that something irreversible had likely happened, even as some stubborn part of her refused to fully accept it. Cody, only 14 at the time, insisted on joining search parties along the reservoir shoreline himself, walking sections of trail with volunteer groups twice his age, searching for any sign of his father, with an intensity that adults in the search parties later described as almost frightening to witness in someone so young. Maddie, only 11, spent much of those 2 weeks with her grandmother, largely shielded from the details of the search but acutely aware, in the way children often are, that something had shifted permanently in the quiet of the house. Local news coverage picked up the story within the first week, running segments on the search efforts and interviewing tearful neighbors who described Walter as a pillar of the community, a hard-working family man whose disappearance made no sense to anyone who thought they knew him. The coverage, ordinary and sympathetic at the time, would later become one of the pieces of evidence investigators used to reconstruct exactly how convincingly Walter's disappearance had been staged, since nothing in the reporting, nor in the recollections of a single person interviewed, suggested anything other than a tragic accident. After nearly 3 weeks without recovery, and following consultation with the county coroner's office, Walter Hastings was declared legally deceased based on the circumstances of his disappearance, the recovered life jacket, and witness accounts confirming his truck and gear at the boat launch that morning. A funeral was held in Brennerville that drew nearly the entire town. An empty casket lowered into the ground beside Walter's own parents, a stone placed above it bearing his name and the dates of a life that, unbeknownst to everyone gathered there, was still very much continuing several states away. In the months that followed, Diane filed the necessary claims to access Walter's life insurance policy, a process that took several additional months of paperwork and verification given the unusual circumstances of a death without a recovered body. When the $450,000 payout finally came through, Diane used a significant portion of it to pay off the mortgage and the loans she had only recently discovered existed. Loans that revealed, for the first time, the true scope of the financial trouble Walter had been hiding from her for years. She has said that discovering the debt in the middle of her grief added a layer of confusion she was entirely unprepared for, forcing her to reconcile the version of her husband she had loved and buried with a version who had apparently been carrying secrets she never once suspected. Brennerville, in the way small towns often do, wrapped itself around the Hastings family in the months following the funeral, a kindness that Diane has said she remains grateful for even now, knowing what she eventually learned. Neighbors mowed the lawn without being asked during the weeks Diane could barely bring herself to leave the house. The church organized a rotating schedule of meals that continued for nearly 2 months. Walter's old subcontractors quietly finished out the 2 renovation projects still in progress at the time of his disappearance, at no additional cost to the families who had hired him, a gesture several of them later said felt like the least they could do for a man whose word, as far as any of them knew, had always meant something. Cody returned to school roughly 3 weeks after the funeral, a decision the school counselor recommended as a way of restoring some sense of normal routine, though Cody has said very little about that period felt normal at all. He has described sitting in classes surrounded by classmates who clearly did not know what to say to him, some avoiding him entirely out of an awkward, well-meaning instinct to give him space, others overcompensating with a kind of forced gentleness that felt, to a grieving 14-year-old, almost worse than being ignored. He began seeing a school counselor weekly, sessions Diane insisted on despite Cody's initial reluctance, sessions that focused largely on processing sudden loss rather than anything resembling the more complicated betrayal that would eventually follow. Maddie's adjustment took a different shape entirely. Too young to fully grasp the permanence of what had happened, she spent much of the first year asking questions that Diane has said were almost unbearably difficult to answer. Whether her father could see her from wherever he was now, whether he knew she had lost a tooth, whether he was proud of her drawings that she insisted on keeping in a special folder meant, in her mind, for him to see someday. Diane has said she answered these questions as gently and honestly as she knew how, drawing on her training as a teacher who had counseled grieving students before, never once suspecting that the honest answers she was searching for did not actually apply to her own situation the way she believed they did. Diane herself returned to teaching full-time roughly a year after the funeral, partly out of financial necessity even with the insurance payout covering the family's debts, and partly, she has said, because the structure of the classroom gave her something to hold on to during a period when very little else felt stable. Colleagues describe her during this period as quietly resilient, someone who rarely spoke about her grief openly at work but whose exhaustion was visible in smaller ways, a slower pace in the hallways, a tendency to stay later than necessary grading papers, rather than returning to an empty house sooner than she needed to. Walter, meanwhile, had settled in a small city in the Midwest, working cash jobs under his assumed identity, living modestly in a rented apartment, watching from a careful distance as his own obituary was shared online by people who had once been his neighbors. He has since described this period of his life as a kind of numb, suspended existence, neither fully free of his old life nor genuinely building a new one, haunted by an awareness of what he had done to the people who loved him most. An awareness, he says, grew heavier, not lighter, with each passing year rather than fading the way he had once hoped it might. He has described small, specific moments from those years that he says never left him. Sitting alone in a diner on what would have been Cody's 15th birthday, doing the math in his head and realizing his son was becoming a young man without him anywhere nearby, or passing a hardware store during the holiday season and instinctively reaching for his phone to call Diane about a gift for Maddie before remembering each time freshly that he no longer had a phone she could answer. He took on a new name obtained through channels he later admitted. During eventual questioning, he was deeply ashamed to have pursued and built a routine around avoiding anything that might connect him back to Brennerville. No social media, no contact with old friends, no searching for news from home, a discipline he maintained not because it grew easier with time, but because he forced himself to treat it as non-negotiable. The way a person might treat a strict diet or an addiction they were terrified of relapsing into. For nearly 3 years, the plan held. Diane slowly rebuilt a life for herself and the children, grieving in the way any widow grieves, unaware that the grief itself was built on a lie. She dated cautiously, briefly, nearly 2 years after Walter's disappearance, a relationship she ended after only a few months, telling friends at the time that something about it simply did not feel right yet, a feeling she would later come to understand with a clarity she did not have access to at the time. Cody, now approaching adulthood, has said he spent those years carrying a version of his father frozen at the moment he disappeared, a version he alternately idealized and quietly resented for leaving them the way he believed he had. He took on more responsibility around the house than most boys his age, mowing the lawn without being asked, checking the truck's oil, small acts he has since admitted were his own way of trying to fill a space he did not fully understand how to fill. Maddie, younger and less able to fully process the loss at the time it happened, grew up largely without a clear memory of her father beyond photographs and the stories other people told her. Memories she has said felt more like inherited stories than genuine recollections of her own. The unraveling began, as these things often do, with an ordinary coincidence rather than any deliberate investigation. A distant cousin of Diane's, named Karen, traveling through the Midwest for an unrelated family matter, stopped at a hardware store to pick up supplies for a home project and happened to glance across the parking lot at a man loading lumber into the back of a pickup truck. Something about the way the man moved, a particular gesture with his hand as he adjusted his cap, struck Karen as unmistakably familiar. Familiar enough that she found herself staring longer than she meant to, certain in a way she could not immediately explain that she was looking at someone she had believed dead for nearly 3 years. She did not approach him directly. Instead, she quietly took a photograph from a distance using her phone, telling herself she was likely mistaken, that grief and long drives could play tricks on a person's mind, before continuing on with her original errand. She has since described spending the rest of that afternoon distracted, running the encounter over and over in her mind, comparing the man's build, his posture, even the particular way he had tilted his head, against her memory of Walter from family gatherings years earlier. It was only that evening, sitting in a motel room replaying the moment in her head, that she found herself unable to shake the certainty that had settled over her, and made the difficult decision to send the photograph to Diane rather than simply let the strange coincidence pass without mention. Diane has described receiving that photograph as one of the strangest moments of her life, staring at a slightly blurred image of a man in a baseball cap, loading lumber into a truck, recognizing, with a certainty that defied every rational explanation available to her, the exact way her husband used to stand, the particular set of his shoulders, a posture she had watched for nearly 2 decades of marriage and would have recognized anywhere. Her first instinct, she has said, was disbelief bordering on anger at herself for even entertaining the thought, certain that grief was doing exactly what grief sometimes does, conjuring familiar shapes out of strangers. But the feeling would not leave her, and after 2 sleepless nights staring at the photograph enlarged on her laptop screen, she decided she needed to know for certain, one way or another. She did not tell her children immediately. Instead, she spent the following days quietly investigating on her own, working with Karen to identify the specific hardware store and the general neighborhood where the encounter had taken place, eventually hiring a private investigator experienced in locating individuals who did not wish to be found. She told the investigator only that she needed to confirm the identity of a man in a photograph without initially revealing the full, almost unbelievable context behind the request. unsure herself how to explain a suspicion that sounded, even to her own ears, like something out of a movie rather than her own life. The investigator began by canvassing the area immediately surrounding the hardware store, showing enlarged printouts of the photograph to nearby business owners and rental property managers. A slow, methodical process that took the better part of 2 weeks before yielding its first solid lead. A landlord who recognized the man as a quiet, reliable tenant who paid his modest rent in cash every month and kept almost entirely to himself. The investigator confirmed, within roughly 3 weeks total, that a man matching Walter's description had been living under an assumed identity in the same Midwest city for approximately 2.5 years, working cash-based construction jobs, renting a modest apartment alone, with no evidence of any new relationship or family, a detail Diane has said mattered to her more than almost anything else uncovered during the investigation. A small, strange comfort inside an otherwise devastating discovery. The investigator also obtained a clear photograph of the man from a discreet distance, a photograph that, once compared side by side with pictures of Walter from before his disappearance, left almost no room for doubt in Diane's mind. She has described sitting at her kitchen table late at night, the same table where she and Walter used to sit together after the children had gone to bed, staring at that comparison photograph until the sun began to rise, trying and failing to reconcile the overwhelming relief of knowing he was alive with an anger so total it frightened her, an anger unlike anything she had ever experienced toward another human being in her life. Rather than confronting Walter directly herself, Diane made the decision to contact law enforcement, given the fraudulent life insurance claim that had already been paid out based on his staged death, a decision she has described as one of the hardest of her life, made not out of a desire for revenge, but out of a need to finally understand the full truth of what had happened to her family, and out of a recognition that whatever came next needed to happen through proper channels, rather than a confrontation she did not trust herself to navigate alone. Federal investigators, working alongside local authorities, confirmed the identity of the man in the Midwest city within days of Diane's report, using facial recognition analysis alongside the private investigator's findings, cross-referencing employment records under the assumed name against fingerprint data collected years earlier, when Walter had obtained a contractor's license in Pennsylvania. The match came back conclusive within 72 hours, and a coordinated arrest was arranged for the following week, timed to occur without incident at Walter's rented apartment rather than at his workplace. Out of consideration, investigators later noted, for the other tenants and employers who had no knowledge of the true circumstances surrounding the quiet, reliable man they had come to know. Walter Hastings was taken into custody outside the apartment he had been renting, arrested on charges including insurance fraud, identity theft, and obstruction related to the false report of his own death, charges that carried the possibility of significant prison time given the scale of the fraud and the length of time it had continued undetected. Witnesses at the scene described him as calm, almost unsurprised, standing quietly with his hands behind his back, as though some part of him had been waiting for this exact moment for a very long time, perhaps even longer than he had ever admitted to himself. During questioning, Walter did not attempt to deny what he had done, describing instead, in what investigators later characterized as a strangely calm and almost relieved manner, the full sequence of events, the mounting debt, the months of quiet planning, the 6-mile walk through the woods surrounding the reservoir, and the 3 years that followed, living under a name that was never truly his own. He walked investigators through the entire timeline methodically, the cash withdrawals, the purchase of the second vehicle, the fabricated identity documents, answering every question without hesitation, as though the act of finally telling the complete truth, even to strangers in an interrogation room, offered him a kind of relief he had not felt in years. He told investigators that the hardest part of the entire ordeal had never been the planning or even the disappearance itself, but the daily discipline required to avoid any contact with his old life, a discipline that had worn thinner with each passing year rather than growing easier as he had originally hoped it eventually would. He described, almost clinically, the specific rules he had imposed on himself: never searching for news from Brennerville, never reaching out to old friends even through anonymous channels, never allowing himself to drive within a certain radius of anywhere he might accidentally be recognized. Rules he said he followed with the same rigid discipline a person might apply to recovery from an addiction, understanding that a single lapse could unravel everything in an instant. The reunion between Walter and his family, when it finally happened, took place not in the emotional, tearful scene many might expect from a story like this one, but in a supervised setting arranged through his attorney and Diane's, given the ongoing criminal proceedings. Cody has said he refused to see his father for several weeks after learning the truth, needing time to process an anger that felt, in his words, larger than anything he had ever experienced. Anger not just at the deception itself, but at the years of grief he now understood had never needed to happen at all. When he finally agreed to a supervised visit, he has said he spent most of it in near silence, watching his father across a small table, searching for some sign of the man he remembered and finding, instead, someone who looked simultaneously familiar and like a stranger wearing his father's face. Maddie, younger and perhaps more willing to seek understanding before judgment, agreed to a supervised visit sooner, though she has said the experience left her with more questions than answers about who her father really was underneath the version she thought she had known. She has described asking him directly, during that first visit, whether he had ever thought about her and Cody during the years he was gone, and has said his answer, that he thought about them every single day, and that the thinking never once made it easier, was both the most honest and the most painful thing she has ever heard another person say to her. Diane, for her part, has said she does not know whether she will ever fully forgive Walter for what he did, not simply the fraud itself, but the 3 years of genuine grief he allowed her and their children to carry unnecessarily, grief that shaped how both children moved through adolescence, grief that changed how Diane herself understood grief and trust for the rest of her life. She has described the strange, disorienting experience of having to essentially re-meet her own husband as a stranger, a man legally alive again after being declared dead, someone she was now required to interact with through attorneys and restitution hearings, rather than through the ordinary intimacy of a marriage. She has said the version of Walter she mourned at that funeral, flawed but fundamentally decent, a man who would never have done something so calculated to the people who loved him, no longer exists in her mind in the same way, replaced by a more complicated, harder truth she is still learning to sit with. The insurance company that had paid out the original $450,000 claim pursued its own civil action separately from the criminal case, seeking full repayment of the funds along with damages related to the fraudulent claim. Diane, who had used much of the money to pay off the mortgage and outstanding loans years earlier without any knowledge of Walter's plan, found herself in the difficult position of potentially losing the family home a second time, this time not to grief, but to the legal consequences of a fraud she had never known, was being committed in her name as the policy's beneficiary. Her attorney ultimately negotiated a settlement that allowed her to retain the home while repaying a portion of the funds over time, a resolution that spared the children from losing the only stable home they had left, though it added years of financial strain to a family already stretched thin by everything else they had endured. Walter ultimately pleaded guilty to the fraud and related charges, receiving a sentence that reflected both the financial scale of the deception and the emotional harm inflicted on his family and community, a sentence he has reportedly accepted without contesting, telling his attorney at one point that whatever consequences came his way felt, in some strange sense, easier to face than the 3 years he had spent looking over his shoulder, waiting for exactly this moment to eventually arrive. From prison, he has written letters to both of his children, letters Cody has said he has not yet been ready to open, and Maddie has said she reads occasionally, though she is careful, in her words, not to let them rewrite the years she spent without him into something softer than they actually were. Was justice really served in a case where the greatest damage was never financial at all, but the years of grief a family carried for a man who was never actually gone? Would you have recognized the small signs Diane missed in the months before his disappearance? The solo fishing trips, the sudden withdrawn silences, the quiet financial strain hidden just beneath the surface of an otherwise ordinary life, the late nights on the porch that seemed, at the time, like nothing more than the ordinary weight of running a small business. Looking back, Diane has said the signs were there in small, scattered pieces the entire time, pieces that only formed a complete picture once she already knew what she was looking for, which she has said is perhaps the cruelest part of hindsight. That clarity so often arrives only after it can no longer help. What do you think would have finally happened if that cousin had never glanced across that parking lot at exactly the right moment? Do you think Walter would have stayed hidden indefinitely, slowly building a quieter version of a life somewhere far from Brennerville? Or do you believe the weight of what he had done would have eventually forced him back into the open on his own, unable to sustain the discipline of that hidden life forever? Walter himself has said, when asked this question directly during questioning, that he honestly did not know the answer, that some days in those 3 years he believed he could have continued indefinitely, and other days he lay awake certain he would eventually walk into a police station somewhere and turn himself in simply to end the exhausting effort of maintaining a lie that never stopped costing him something, even when no one around him could see the cost. Let us know in the comments below what you think really drives a person to go to such extreme lengths rather than simply facing the consequences of their choices honestly, and whether you believe 3 years is enough time or nowhere near enough time for a family to even begin rebuilding trust after a betrayal built on a lie this large. And if this story left you shaken, wait until you hear what happened when a small town discovered their beloved local doctor had been living under 3 different identities across 3 different states for over a decade. A case that began, much like this one, with a single stranger noticing something that felt just slightly out of place. Subscribe for more real-life stories of trust, betrayal, and the people left to pick up the pieces.